Hi, ladies and gentlemen of Science 142, What the Cell. Today we're going to talk about viruses, and viruses are really important, especially right now during the COVID, because we are all at home doing virtual school because of a darn virus. So I want to kind of tell you what a virus is, what it does, how it's different from a cell, and how it takes over cells. The first thing we're going to look at is, are viruses alive or not? There is still a debate about this. And if you ask me, my personal opinion would be not. There's something else, unless we want to change the definition of life, which science could do. But by its current definition, I do not think that viruses count as alive. Let's talk about why. This picture is so great. So this orange looking thing is a cell. It's a bacterial cell. And these alien lander pod looking things are the viruses. So these are called bacteriophages. And a conspiracy theory that I would totally believe is that aliens sent viruses to the Earth. Because look at this. This just doesn't seem like it could be. It looks like a machine. It doesn't look like a cell or a living thing. I'm just kidding. I don't believe in that conspiracy theory, but it would be convincing with this picture, right? Okay, so the definition of virus, and here you're going to be writing this down, so make sure you're ready with your pencil, and you can pause anytime. This is the definition of a virus. It is a submicroscopic infectious agent. Well, those are a lot of words I should probably spell out, huh? So submicroscopic, that's submicroscopic, and it means smaller than what a microscope can see. So you can see cells with a microscope, but you cannot see viruses. Infectious is the next word, infectious. That means it infects cells. And then agent, that replicates only in the cells of another organism. So viruses do not replicate themselves. They can't reproduce. They can infect just about any living thing. So multicellular things would be like you or the papaya that's in the picture. This papaya actually has a virus, and it's called the ring something virus because it makes these little circles on the papayas. And basically all papayas were getting infected with this virus. It was very prolific. It was everywhere. So they actually changed the DNA of the papaya so that it would not be susceptible to this virus anymore. And now we can eat papayas again because they were basically all getting this disease and now they don't. So that's kind of a cool thing that scientists can do with genetic engineering. Okay, a unicellular thing that could get infected would be like an amoeba, like the amoeba sisters, or a bacteria. But basically, viruses can attack anything that's alive. The biggest difference between, or the biggest visual difference between a cell and a virus is the size. And we're going to refer to that as scale. So the scale of a virus is going to be a lot smaller than the scale of a cell. So in this picture, there is a red blood cell and a bacterium. So you can see that bacteria are way smaller than human animal cells. And that's because they don't have those membrane-bound organelles and everything inside of them, so they don't have to be nearly as big. But the red blood cell, if you look at it, compared to the influenza virus, which is the flu, they are very significantly different in size. And this picture actually includes a picture of the COVID-19 virus. So you can see over here how small it would be compared to a blood cell. So that's how come when we have masks, we have to make sure that there's several layers because you don't want those little virus particles going in between the spaces of the fabric of your mask. So even though your mask will stop a lot of the particles because they're wet and so they stick to the fabric, it doesn't stop all of them because they're just so incredibly small. The hospital masks that they have that do stop all of the particles are really uncomfortable because they have to be like basically like anchored to your face, so they leave a mark, and they're really hard to breathe through because you have to use a lot of energy to push the air particles through, and it has to be small enough to stop things like a SARS virus. And just so you know, air particles, atoms, are generally smaller than viruses. So that's why a mask will work. Scientists have basically figured out that there are certain characteristics that every single living thing has. So of course, within these characteristics, there's a great amount of variety. For example, plants make their own food, but then there's us animals, we have to eat things, and that's a very different way to get energy. But we all have to get energy, all living things. So I want to go over these with some examples, and I found this cool collage of pictures of different living creatures. There's not very many that are unicellular. This one is unicellular right here. These ones are diatoms, but for the most part, these are all things that are going to be multi-celled. This one is a unicellular, but over here there's like a water bear, and this is microscopic. You can only see it with a microscope, but it is still much bigger than like a bacteria or something. But that's the problem with a lot of pictures of a bunch of organisms, because you can't see those things, and so you don't recognize them, and so they kind of like don't put very many of them in these collages. But let's talk about maintaining homeostasis. This should be a reminder because we've covered this in a previous term. Homeostasis is stable internal conditions. So inside of a squirrel, there's a lot of stuff going on to make sure that the squirrel has the right temperature on the inside and that it has the right pH in its blood. All living things have to maintain homeostasis, even if they're only one cell. So I hope you're writing down what's written on the slide, but then also an example. Energy and metabolism. So plants, they don't have to eat, but they still have to make their own energy. They make their own food using photosynthesis. Metabolism means how you burn your calories. So how do you use that energy? And there's a bunch of different ways to use it, but basically we all make ATP, and ATP basically is the money for any sort of cell function that we do. So we have to pay ATP to get anything done inside the body, and that is our metabolism. Even a bacteria has to make ATP, but they might make it differently than us because they don't have all the cell structures that we do. Reproduction, that's an easy one. You have to make offspring. You have to make new individuals of your species in order to keep going. So there's sexual reproduction like humans use, but then remember bacteria use binary fission, in which they just split themselves in half and basically make a clone copy. Responding to stimuli. So this is one of those things where it's not a specific term for science, but a stimulus, stimuli is the plural, is something that happens around an organism. And organisms have to be able to respond to that. So if, let's say, you were in class and a student dropped a book in a hallway and it made a big noise, everyone in the class would be looking towards the door. You would be responding to that sound. But trees also respond to stimuli. They just do it differently than we do because they're not super fast at things. They don't just turn their head. But trees will lose their leaves when it starts getting cold. Fleas, oh my gosh, this is creepy. Flea eggs will respond to carbon dioxide. So you can have a flea egg that's in your house and it hasn't been doing anything for 9 months. And then if you walk by it and you're close enough and you breathe out carbon dioxide, it can actually notice the carbon dioxide and hatch so that it has something to eat and latch onto you. Isn't that nuts? Anyways, all things grow and change over time. So babies are really small. They make more cells, they have reproduction, they get older, they die. So basically all living things have to come to an end. All living things have to have DNA because that's how we get our proteins to do stuff. We spent a whole entire term on that. And here's another one we spent an entire term on, is that living things have to evolve. So there's going to be natural mutations that occur, and the ones that are good are going to be adaptations that make an organism more able to survive, and the ones that are bad are going to possibly cause an animal to go extinct. And then other ones that are just neutral just get carried through our DNA information as long as the species exists. But you have to have the population levels change over time. And that's why, even though we do not have dinosaurs on the earth right now, we have things that are a lot like dinosaurs on the earth right now, like chickens and alligators. And the last one is that living things have to be made of one or more cells. Remember, that's part of cell theory, which we learned about earlier in this term. So let's see if these characteristics of life apply to viruses. Here are some example viruses. They're really hard to get pictures of. You have to use an electron microscope because they're so small. So the microscopes we have in our science lab use light and magnification to see it. But here you actually have to basically interact with the electrons or the electromagnetic spectrum of a object in order to get a picture of it. And so we don't have an electron microscope because they're really freaking expensive. But if I was a millionaire, I'd totally buy one for our school. Or maybe I'd have to be a billionaire, honestly. Okay, so these are the models, of course, the drawings of what they look like. And then here's what they look like in actual life. But these are all false color images. Electron microscope images just show up as black and white. So this is kind of a model as well. All right, do viruses maintain homeostasis? Kinda. So viruses do have internal conditions, but viruses, unlike cells, they can survive in really weird places because they don't have to maintain internal temperature. So when you have a bacteria could be killed just if it's too hot. Viruses are not as susceptible to things like heat or cold to stop them from working because they don't really maintain homeostasis. Energy and metabolism. Do viruses eat? Do they make their own food? No, they really don't. We'll talk about what they actually do, but they don't really make their own food. So when a virus, they kind of like float around and they will notice the stimuli. They will respond to a stimuli if there's like a cell that has a certain receptor protein or if it's a cell that they want to infect. And by want to, I mean they don't have a brain, but they're just programmed to notice these different types of cells. And so they will inject their DNA, and some of them get absorbed directly into a cell. So they put it into a cell, and then instead of them using energy to make more viruses, they actually hijack the cell, and the cell, instead of doing its normal functions, makes more viruses instead. Sometimes it makes so many viruses that it explodes open and all the viruses exit the one cell that they were made in and then spread all over and create an infection that's even worse. So that kind of answers this reproduction question as well. Do viruses reproduce? Well, kind of. They replicate, but they don't reproduce themselves. They're not making a baby on their own. Do they respond to stimuli? Well, yeah, sort of, but not that much. Okay, so they're not going to be able to swim around like they could if they were a bacteria that has a tail or a flagella to swim around. They just kind of have to float around, and then if they get lucky, they land in the right spot. They grow and change over time? Not really, not at all. Do they contain DNA? Actually, some viruses don't contain DNA. They just have RNA inside of them. So some contain DNA, some don't. And here's one that I know you know is true because they've talked about different mutations of the coronavirus. So sometimes the coronavirus will change and have a mutation. If it's a mutation that makes it more spreadable, then a bunch more people catch it. And then scientists freak out because they're like, uh-oh, this is not good. A bunch of people are more susceptible to this virus because it changed a little bit. So viruses do evolve. They do change over time with mutations. But those mutations are being made by the host cell that is copying their proteins. So they're not really evolving themselves. They're just basically having mistakes when the cell is copying them. Okay, The last thing, are they made of one or more cells? No, they're not made of a cell. They're way smaller than a cell, and they don't have any of the cell structures that we talk about, like lysosomes and mitochondria and a nucleus. They're just basically a protein coat with a set of genetic information on the inside, sometimes RNA and sometimes DNA. So a big thing to remember here from this lesson is that viruses cannot reproduce themselves. They cannot make themselves. So when someone gets sick with the coronavirus, what happens is that that virus goes into their body and then it gets into their cells and it attacks lung cells, I believe, because that's where people are getting really sick. It attacks your respiratory system. And instead of your respiratory system doing what it's supposed to be doing for you to stay alive, it starts making more coronaviruses instead. It's hijacked. And that's what makes people so sick, is that their body isn't doing what it's supposed to do. There are some lasting effects of the coronavirus for some people. Some people are getting what's called the long COVID, which means that they're having symptoms even after they're technically better and not infected anymore. And that could be because of permanent damage. I've also heard of some brain issues that are showing up in people, like permanent brain damage due to the coronavirus. So there's a lot we don't know about what damage it's doing to the cells of our body. But the good news is we recently have a vaccine that will keep it from giving you any of those problems. And so that's the next part of the lesson, is talking about how exactly the virus is going to be contained using this new vaccine. Have a good day. And direct me any questions you have about the coronavirus. I'll find them for you because I do not like misinformation about it spreading around like it is.